The photograph was the only thing Elijah Conroy had left of her, a small tintype no bigger than the palm of his hand, its edges worn smooth from 3 years of daily handling, and on the back, in handwriting that was not his own, were 4 words that had become the compass of his entire existence. "Find me. I'm waiting." He had not known her name when he first found it. He had not known anything about her except what the photograph revealed. A woman in her mid-20s, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, standing beside a tall oak tree with one hand resting on the bark, as if the tree itself were something she intended to claim. There was a boldness in her posture that he had never seen in a woman's portrait before, something that suggested she was not merely tolerating the photographer's lens but staring straight through it, straight into whatever future the image might carry. She looked like someone who had already made her decisions and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Elijah had found the photograph in the summer of 1879. Tucked inside a saddlebag he had purchased off a dead man at a trading post near Dodge City, Kansas. The dead man had been a drifter, shot in a dispute over a card game, and had left behind nothing of apparent value: a battered tin cup, a broken compass, $3 and the saddlebag itself, which Elijah had bought for the leather alone. He had not discovered the photograph until he was already 2 days out of Dodge, and when he held it up to the afternoon light and saw that face looking back at him, something in his chest had shifted in a way he could not explain and had never entirely recovered from. He was 26 years old at the time. He had been riding for cattle outfits since he was 17, had spent 9 years sleeping under open sky and eating dust, and learning the language of horses and cattle and the endlessly shifting terrain of the American West. He was not a romantic man by nature. He was not the kind of man who believed in signs or fate or the invisible threads that some people claimed connected one soul to another across impossible distances. He was practical and stubborn and competent in the exact way that the frontier demanded, and when he told the story of finding the photograph later, he always insisted that it was not some mystical force that made him decide to find her. It was simply that she had asked him to, and he was not the kind of man who ignored a direct request. But that was only part of the truth, and he knew it. The full truth was that he had looked at her face and felt something wake up inside him that he had not known was sleeping, something that recognized, in ways he could not articulate, that this woman was someone worth crossing a territory to find. He started asking questions at every town he passed through. He would produce the photograph carefully, keeping it protected from wind and grit between 2 flat pieces of leather he had fashioned into a small case, and he would hold it out to bartenders and postmasters and mercantile owners and the women who ran boarding houses, asking if anyone knew the face. In the first year, the answers were always the same: head shakes, polite refusals, occasional curiosity that led nowhere. He learned that the saddlebag had belonged to a man named Jasper Foote, according to the trading post operator who had handled the sale. Jasper Foote had come through Dodge City from the south, from Texas, which at least gave Elijah a direction. He turned his horse south and began working his way through the vast and complicated landscape of Texas, through cattle towns and river crossings and sprawling ranches and small settlement communities that barely qualified as towns at all. In a small settlement outside San Antonio, in the spring of 1880, he got his first real lead. An older woman running a dry goods store looked at the photograph for a long moment, and then looked up at Elijah with something careful in her expression. "I have seen this woman," the woman said slowly, "or someone very like her. There was a young woman by that description who passed through here some months back, maybe 6 months. She was asking about a man herself, actually, a drifter. She had a photograph too, from what I recall." Elijah's heart had kicked hard against his ribs. "Did she give a name?" "Wainwright," the woman said. "Emma Wainwright, if I am remembering correctly. She was heading toward the hill country, said she had reason to believe the man she was looking for had passed through the Western Territories." Emma Wainwright. He had a name now. He said it quietly to himself as he walked back to where his horse, a steady dark bay he called Copperhead, was tied at the rail outside. Emma Wainwright. The name suited her somehow, the way names sometimes did when you finally attached them to a face you had already been carrying in your imagination. What he did not know yet, what he would not learn until much later, was exactly how the photograph had come to be in Jasper Foote's saddlebag, and why Emma Wainwright had written those 4 words on the back. Emma Wainwright was 24 years old in the summer of 1879, and she was living in a boarding house in Austin, Texas, working as a seamstress and doing laundry work on the side to supplement her income. She had been in Austin for nearly 2 years by then, having left her family's farm in the hill country of central Texas after her parents died of typhoid fever in the winter of 1877. She had a younger sister, Clara, who had gone to live with an aunt in Tennessee, and she had the farm itself, which she had been unable to keep running alone, and had eventually been forced to sell at a price that barely covered the debts her father had accumulated. She had come to Austin because it was the largest city within reasonable reach, because she had heard there was work there for a woman willing to apply herself, and because staying in the hill country surrounded by the ghost of everything she had lost felt like a kind of slow suffocation she could not afford. She had been managing. That was the most generous word she could find for her situation. She was surviving, maintaining a narrow and careful existence, sending money when she could to her sister, saving what little remained, and trying to figure out what came next. The photograph of Elijah Conroy had come into her possession through a strange chain of circumstances that she sometimes thought would strain the credulity of anyone she tried to explain it to. In the spring of 1879, a man named Randolph Foote had come to the boarding house where she lived, looking for a room. He was a cattleman's agent, passing through Austin on business, and he was Jasper Foote's older brother, though Emma did not know that at the time. Randolph Foote had stayed at the boarding house for 3 weeks, and in that time he and Emma had developed the cautious, measured friendship that sometimes grew between people thrown together by proximity and circumstance. On his last evening in Austin, Randolph Foote had shown her a photograph. It was a photograph of a man, taken apparently at some kind of commemorative occasion. The man was standing straight and tall, hat in hand, with the look of someone who had agreed to the photographer's request, but found the whole enterprise faintly ridiculous. He had dark eyes and a jaw that suggested considerable stubbornness, and despite the formality of the occasion, there was something about his expression that suggested he was the kind of man who laughed easily when he chose to. "This is a young man I know," Randolph Foote had said. "Good man, honest and hardworking, no family left to speak of. His name is Elijah Conroy. He has been riding cattle drives most of his adult life, and I think he deserves better than he has gotten." Emma had looked at the photograph and felt something she was not prepared to feel, a sudden and unexpected pull toward a stranger's face. "Why are you showing me this?" she had asked. Randolph Foote had smiled in a way that suggested he was not entirely sure himself. "Because I think the world could be smaller sometimes than it lets on," he said. "And because I have a feeling that a man like Elijah Conroy and a woman like Emma Wainwright might do each other a great deal of good, if the world could just cooperate long enough to put them in the same place." He had left the photograph with her. She had told herself she would throw it away, or at least put it somewhere she would not see it daily. Instead, she had done neither of those things. She had looked at it every morning for a month, this man she had never met, this Elijah Conroy with his stubborn jaw and his reluctant expression and his dark eyes that seemed to hold some private knowledge she could not read. And then, on an impulse she could not entirely justify even to herself, she had written on the back of it, "Find me. I'm waiting." She had not known at the time that she was writing to anyone in particular. She had not sent it to Elijah Conroy directly because she did not know where he was. She had written those words the way a person sometimes speaks aloud into an empty room, not expecting an answer but needing to say the thing anyway. She had given the photograph to Randolph Foot's brother, Jasper, who passed through Austin 3 weeks later on his way north. She had asked him, somewhat impulsively, to find Elijah Conroy and give him the photograph. It was a strange request, and she knew it. Jasper Foot had looked at her with a curiosity that bordered on amusement, and said he would do his best. He had not been carrying the photograph long before he met his unfortunate end in Dodge City, which meant that Elijah Conroy never received it through proper channels. Instead, the photograph had found its own way to him, through the accident of a dead man's saddlebag and a purchase made for practical reasons. By the time Emma learned in late 1879 that Jasper Foot had died before completing her errand, she was faced with an unsettling question. Had anyone found the photograph? Had it been lost or discarded or buried with the man who was carrying it? She did not know. She had no way of knowing. What she did know was that she could not stop thinking about the possibility. She could not stop thinking about Elijah Conroy, this man she had never met, this man whose photograph she had been carrying the way he, though she did not know it yet, had been carrying hers. She had begun asking questions of her own. This is what made the search what it was. Not one person looking for another, but two people looking for each other simultaneously, moving through the same landscape from different directions, missing each other by weeks or months in one town after another, each one gathering fragments of the other's trail and pressing forward on the strength of those fragments, neither of them quite willing to accept that this thing between them, this thing that had never even properly started, might simply not be possible. Elijah spent the summer of 1880 in the hill country of central Texas, following Emma Wainwright's trail from one small community to the next. He had learned by then that she had left Austin sometime in the early months of that year, and that she had been moving roughly westward, asking questions about a man named Elijah Conroy at every stop. The first time he heard that, the first time someone told him that a dark-haired young woman had been through asking about a man by his exact name, he had stood very still for a long moment in the middle of a dusty main street, and felt something so strange and overwhelming that he had needed to sit down on the nearest available surface, which happened to be a water trough. She was looking for him. She had always been looking for him. He did not understand yet how she even knew his name, or what connection existed between them, or how she had come to write those 4 words on the back of his photograph. He only knew that somewhere in this enormous, difficult landscape, a woman named Emma Wainwright was moving toward him with the same stubborn, determined intent that he was moving toward her, and that understanding changed something fundamental in the nature of his search. It was no longer simply the pursuit of a mystery. It had become a conversation conducted across geography and time, and he was desperate to hear what she would say to his face. He pushed harder after that. He rode longer days, stopped in every settlement no matter how small, asked his questions with increasing urgency. People remembered Emma Wainwright. She was not a woman easily forgotten. She was direct and capable and possessed of a quiet confidence that made an impression, and the people she had spoken to in the various towns and trading posts and way stations of central and western Texas tended to recall her clearly. What Elijah was also learning, piece by piece, was the shape of her life. He learned about the farm she had lost. He learned about her parents and the typhoid fever and the younger sister in Tennessee. He learned that she was a skilled seamstress who had found work wherever she went, and that she was saving money with considerable discipline. He learned that she had a sharp sense of humor, and that she did not suffer foolishness from anyone, man or woman, and that she had once dressed down a hotel clerk in a small town outside Fredericksburg in terms that had made the clerk's ears go red, and had earned the respectful admiration of everyone who witnessed it. He found all of this out from strangers, and with every new detail, his sense of her became more vivid, more real, more urgently present in his mind. The photograph in his pocket was no longer a mystery. It was a portrait of someone he felt he was beginning to know. Emma, meanwhile, had worked her way into the western reaches of Texas by the late summer of 1880. She had run low on money twice, and had stopped both times to take on work sewing and mending in one town, cooking in another, before pressing on. She had developed a network of sorts, a loose constellation of postmasters and boarding house operators and general store owners who had agreed to hold any messages she left, in case the man she was looking for came through asking after her. She had started leaving messages about 8 months into her search. She had written them out on small cards and left them with people who seemed reliable, little notes that said simply, "Emma Wainwright was here and is heading west. If Elijah Conroy comes looking, tell him she is following the Pecos River." It was a bet on the hope that he was looking. She had not been entirely sure of that, not in the beginning. But the more people she spoke to, the more she found traces of a man asking questions about a woman and a photograph, and she came to understand that yes, he was out there, yes, he was moving through the same world, and yes, he was looking for her with the same unreasonable, stubborn, beautiful determination with which she was looking for him. She had never told anyone the full reason for her search. She had said, when pressed, that she was trying to locate a man she had been corresponding with, which was not exactly a lie. The photograph and the written words on its back were a kind of correspondence. The most unusual kind, perhaps, but a correspondence nonetheless. What she had not told anyone was that she was also half afraid that, when she finally found him, the reality of Elijah Conroy the man would be entirely different from the Elijah Conroy she had constructed in her imagination over the months of searching. She had built him up in her mind, not into some impossible ideal, she was too practical for that, but into a particular kind of person. Someone steady and honest and capable of real feeling beneath the surface of frontier toughness. Someone worth crossing a territory to find. She had found in the traces he had left behind evidence for all of those qualities. People described him in terms she recognized from Randolph Foote's original recommendation. Good man, honest, hardworking. They described a man who was courteous to women and patient with his horse, and who paid his debts without complaint. None of which was proof of the deeper qualities she was imagining, but all of which suggested a foundation worth building on. She reached a small town called Marfa in early October of 1880. Marfa was barely more than a cluster of adobe buildings and a single main street at that point, a watering stop on the route west, surrounded by the wide-open country of the Trans-Pecos region, where the landscape took on a grandeur that Emma found simultaneously beautiful and intimidating. The mountains in the distance were violet in the evening light, and the sky above them went through colors she had no names for. She took a room at the town's single boarding house, which was run by a woman named Dolores Vargas, a Mexican-American widow in her 50s who had an air of absolute authority about her premises and made the best coffee Emma had encountered anywhere in her travels. "You are looking for someone," Dolores said on Emma's first evening, setting a plate of beans and cornbread in front of her. It was not a question. "Is it that obvious?" Emma asked. "Everyone who comes through Marfa is looking for something," Dolores said, settling into a chair across the small table with her own coffee. "But you have the look of someone who has been looking for a while." Emma showed her the photograph of Elijah Conroy. Dolores studied it with the same careful attention she appeared to give everything. "He has not come through here," she said, "but I will remember him if he does." Emma left her message, as she had in every town before this one, and she stayed in Marfa longer than she had intended because there was work to be had, and because she was running low on funds again, and because, if she was honest with herself, she was also tired. 3 years was a long time to keep moving. Not quite 3 yet, but approaching it, and the weight of all that motion was beginning to settle in her bones. She stayed through October and into November, working with her needle and thread for the local families who needed it, helping Dolores with the boarding house in exchange for reduced rent. She liked Marfa more than she had expected to. She liked the vast open quiet of the surrounding country and the community of people who had settled there. a mix of Anglo-ranchers and Mexican-American families, and a few others who had drifted in from various directions and found something in the place worth staying for. Elijah reached Marfa in late November of 1880. He had ridden hard from the east, following a trail of messages that Emma had left, each one pointing him further west, each one a few months old but still more current than anything he had found before. He arrived in Marfa in the late afternoon of a cool November day, when the mountains to the southwest were catching the last of the golden light, and the town's main street was quiet in the way that small towns were quiet in the hour before supper. He tied Copperhead at the rail in front of what appeared to be a general store and went inside, where a young man was sweeping the floor. "Excuse me," Elijah said, pulling the photograph of Emma Wainwright from its leather case. "I am looking for this woman. Her name is Emma Wainwright. Has she come through Marfa?" The young man looked at the photograph and then looked up at Elijah with an expression of considerable surprise. "She is here," he said. "She has been staying with Dolores Vargas these past 6 weeks." Elijah stood absolutely still for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "Where is Dolores Vargas's boarding house?" He had imagined this moment more times than he could count. In his imaginings, it had always been simpler than reality turned out to be. In his imaginings, he walked in, she turned around, and everything resolved itself in the uncomplicated way of recognition between two people who were meant to know each other. What he had not imagined adequately was the extraordinary, almost unbearable weight of the moment as he walked down the main street of Marfa toward the boarding house, with his heart doing something entirely undisciplined inside his chest. He knocked on the door of Dolores Vargas's establishment. Dolores herself answered, looked him up and down with the evaluating gaze of a woman who had seen every variety of man come through her door, and said, "You are Elijah Conroy." He blinked. "How did you know?" "Because Emma described you to me," Dolores said, "and because you are carrying a case that is exactly the shape of a protected photograph." She stepped back from the door. "Come in. She is in the kitchen." He followed Dolores through the small, neat interior of the boarding house, through a parlor with a wood-burning stove and 2 upholstered chairs and a braided rug, and into the kitchen at the back, where the smell of cornbread and something savory on the stove filled the warm air. Emma Wainwright was standing at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in an iron pot. She was wearing a dark blue dress with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned at the back of her neck in a practical arrangement that let a few dark strands escape at her temples. She was exactly the woman in the photograph, and also entirely more than that, more present and real and specific than any image could capture. Dolores said quietly from the doorway, "Emma, you have a visitor." Emma turned. Later, she would say that she had known who it was before she saw his face. She would say that there was something in the quality of the silence, something in the way Dolores said those 4 words, that told her the waiting was over. She turned, and there he was, Elijah Conroy, standing in Dolores Vargas's kitchen in Marfa, Texas, with his hat in his hand and his dark eyes wide and fixed on her face, and an expression that she could only describe later, as someone seeing something they had stopped letting themselves fully believe they would ever see. She did not say anything for a long moment. He did not say anything either. They simply looked at each other, these two people who had spent 3 years searching through the same vast and difficult country for each other, and the room was very still. Then Emma said, "You found me." And Elijah said, "You were looking too." "I have been looking since before you started," she said, "though I did not know I was looking until I saw your photograph." He reached into his pocket and produced the leather case, opened it, and held the tintype out to her. She looked at it, her own face looking back at her, and then looked up at him. "I have yours," she said. She crossed the kitchen to where her things were set on a shelf, found a small wrapped package, and unwrapped it to reveal his tintype. She had wrapped it in oilcloth to protect it, the same way he had protected hers between pieces of leather. They stood there in Dolores Vargas's kitchen, each holding a photograph of the other, and the absurdity and the beauty of it all hit Elijah so hard that he laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and surprised. Emma looked at him sharply for a moment, and then she laughed too, and it was the best sound he had ever heard in his life. Dolores Vargas, still standing in the doorway, smiled to herself and went back to the parlor, allowing them their moment. "I do not know how to explain any of this," Emma said, when the laughter had settled into something quieter and more complex. "I saw your photograph and I wrote those words on the back, and I thought it was a foolish impulse and half expected nothing to come of it. And then I kept thinking about you, about a stranger's face in a photograph, and I could not make myself stop." "Randolph Foote," Elijah said. "That is the connection. His brother Jasper was carrying your photograph when he died. I bought his saddlebag and found it inside." Emma was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone recalibrating. "Randall told me you were a good man," she said finally. "He was very certain about it." "He said the same of you," Elijah said, "in a roundabout way." She studied him with the same direct, evaluating gaze that had arrested his attention in the photograph. Up close, those eyes were a very dark brown with hints of amber in the outer edges, and they held the look of someone who was accustomed to making accurate assessments quickly. "You have been riding for 3 years looking for me," she said. "On and off," he said. "I took work when I needed money. Cattle drives, ranch hand work. But yes, 3 years. "I have been riding for approximately the same amount of time," she said, "looking for you." "I know," he said. "I have been finding your messages." Something shifted in her expression, something softer. "I left those because I decided, somewhere around the 8-month mark, that you must be looking. Was I right?" "From the day I found the photograph," he said. She looked down at the tintype in her hands, his image, this face she had spent 3 years imagining in motion, imagining in conversation, imagining in all the ordinary and extraordinary moments of a life she had never lived with him. Then she looked up. "We have a great deal to learn about each other," she said. "We know each other entirely from photographs and second-hand accounts." "I know," he said. "I know you make a strong impression on people. I know you are capable and determined, and that you dress down a hotel clerk in Fredericksburg in a manner people are still talking about." Her eyebrows went up. "People told you that?" 3 separate people, he confirmed, all of them admiring. The warmth in her face was not quite a smile, but it was close to one, the kind of expression that preceded a smile by just a breath. "What they probably did not tell you," she said, "is that the clerk deserved it considerably." "I assumed as much," Elijah said. Dolores insisted that Elijah stay for supper. It was not really an invitation so much as a statement of what was going to happen, delivered in the tone of a woman whose hospitality was an act of will rather than a suggestion. Elijah accepted without hesitation, partly because he was genuinely hungry, and partly because supper at Dolores Vargas's table was apparently the best available option for extending the time he had suddenly, miraculously, within reach of Emma Wainwright. The supper was excellent. Dolores produced a pot of chili that could have made a man weep, and fresh cornbread, and coffee so strong it was nearly a solid. She sat with them and ate, and she was not, Elijah noticed, the kind of woman who made herself small or invisible in social situations. She had opinions, and she shared them, primarily on the subjects of local land rights, the quality of the mail service west of the Pecos River, and the general incompetence of a territorial land agent named Dobbs who had been creating difficulties for several of the Mexican-American families in the region. This last subject drew Emma into a conversation with a heat that told Elijah something important about her. She had been in Marfa long enough to understand the local situation, and she was clearly angry about it in a way that was both principled and specific. The land agent, as far as Elijah could gather, had been using procedural technicalities to challenge the property titles of families who had held their land for generations, and Emma had apparently spent some of her time in Marfa helping one of the affected families draft a formal complaint to the territorial office. "It will probably come to nothing," Emma said, "but they have a right to try, and they should have help doing it." Elijah looked at her across the table and thought that he had, in 3 years of imagining this meeting, not quite imagined this specific quality of her, the way she moved between practical action and principle, as if the two were simply the same thing. After supper, Dolores found reasons to be elsewhere, and Elijah and Emma sat on the small, covered porch at the back of the boarding house in the cool November dark, with the mountains a black suggestion against a sky thick with stars. The quiet of the Transpicos at night was extraordinary, a silence so complete and deep that it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence. They talked for a long time. They talked about the practical things first, the roads they had taken, the towns they had passed through, the near misses that they could now reconstruct between them, occasions when they had been in the same town within weeks of each other. There was one occasion, Elijah discovered, when they had been in the same town, Fredericksburg, separated by 11 days. 11 days, Emma said, with a kind of amazed frustration. If I had stayed 11 days longer. Or if I had arrived 11 days earlier, he said. They let the symmetry of that sit between them for a moment. Then they talked about other things, about her parents and the farm and the years of managing alone. About his childhood, which had been harder than he generally discussed, a father who drank and a mother who had died when he was 12, and a series of years working whatever jobs could be found before he discovered, at 17, that he had a genuine talent for cattle work. About the drives he had ridden up the Kishom Trail, through the heat and dust and thunderstorms and river crossings that defined that particular kind of labor. About the way the West was changing, the railroads coming further and further into territory that had seemed unreachable, the cattle industry reshaping itself in response, the sense of a way of life that was already beginning to shift into something different. "Do you intend to go on working cattle drives?" Emma asked. It was a careful question, he could tell. Not pressing, not presuming anything about what existed between them yet or what he intended, but genuinely curious about the shape of his future. "I had been thinking about land," he said, "before I found the photograph. I had been saving money for a few years with the idea of eventually settling somewhere. The photograph changed the direction of my traveling, but not the underlying intention." She was quiet for a moment. "And now, he said, "I am thinking I would very much like to discuss that with you if you are willing." The directness of it appeared to catch her off guard, though only briefly. She was not a woman who stayed off guard for long. "We have known each other for approximately 4 hours, she said. "We have known each other for 3 years, he said, "in the sense that matters." She looked at him for a long moment in the starlight, and he could see her working through something, measuring the truth of what he said against her own practical caution. He did not rush her. He had learned in 3 years of looking for her that this was not the kind of woman you could rush. "That may be the most persuasive thing anyone has ever said to me," she said at last, and the warmth in her voice told him it was not entirely a joke. They talked until the November cold became genuinely uncomfortable, and then Dolores appeared at the back door and suggested with extreme tact that it was time for reasonable people to be inside, and they went back in, and Elijah took a room at the boarding house for the night, the only available room, which was across the hall from Emma's. He lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time, not sleeping, not troubled, simply present in the extraordinary fact of having arrived. 3 years of motion and uncertainty, and now this. A small room in Marfa, Texas, with Emma Wainwright 20 feet away on the other side of a wall, real and present, and everything the photograph had suggested and more. He fell asleep eventually, still smiling in the dark. In the days that followed, they spent a great deal of time together, partly because there was no good reason not to, and partly because it turned out to be easy in a way that surprised both of them. They were not, either of them, people for whom social ease came automatically. Emma had spent enough time managing alone to have developed a self-sufficiency that could read as distance. Elijah had spent enough time with cattle and horses to be more comfortable with those than with most people. But between the two of them, something functioned with a naturalness that felt less like chemistry, though it was that too, and more like recognition. She took him to meet the families who were dealing with the land agent problem, the Vargas cousins who held adjoining land parcels and had been receiving increasingly threatening notices from the territorial office. Elijah had some experience from his years moving through the territory with the way that land disputes tended to work, and he was able to contribute some practical knowledge to the conversation about what legal remedies might exist. He also offered something else. He had spent time in the company of a former surveyor during one of his cattle drives, and he knew enough about land surveys to understand that the procedural challenge being mounted against the families was relying on a deliberately ambiguous reading of the original Spanish land grant language. If the original grant documents can be located and verified, he said, sitting at the kitchen table of the older of the Vargas cousins, a man named Rodrigo, with Emma beside him and his coffee going cold in front of him, then the agent's claim falls apart. The grant predates the current territorial administration's authority to challenge it. Rodrigo Vargas looked at him with the careful expression of a man who had been given reasons for hope before and had learned to be skeptical of them. And how do we locate those documents? The county land office in San Antonio, Elijah said, or the state capitol? I can write a letter to the land commissioner's office explaining what you have told me and asking for the relevant records to be produced. I am no lawyer, but I can put together a clear enough account of the situation. He spent 2 days writing the letter, working at Dollar's kitchen table with Emma reading over what he had written and suggesting corrections and additions, her eye for clarity and precision being sharper than his own in matters of written language. The result was a thorough document, and it was sent off to Austin with the best hope they could reasonably attach to it. Neither Elijah nor Emma knew at the time whether the letter would accomplish anything. What the writing of it accomplished for them was something else. It gave them a project, something to work on together, and in the working they discovered that they were extraordinarily well matched in complementary ways. Where he had practical knowledge of the territory and the working systems of ranching and land, she had precision and organization and a quality of mind that could identify the essential point in a complicated situation and hold on to it clearly. They did not overlap so completely that they were redundant to each other, and they did not diverge so completely that they could not understand each other. They fit in the particular way that two things fit when they were made to work in tandem. Emma noticed this. She thought about it carefully in the private moments she allowed herself. She had always known from the time she first saw his photograph that there was something she was responding to, but she had told herself that the response was largely imaginative, a construction built on insufficient evidence. What she was discovering now was that the evidence, as it accumulated, did not contradict the construction. It refined it, made it more specific and more real and considerably more formidable as a thing she was going to have to contend with. She was falling in love with him. She had known, in some theoretical way, that this was likely the direction of travel, but the actual experience of it was something different from the theoretical knowing. It was not a sudden dramatic event, a lightning strike or a revelation. It was more like what happened when you walked toward a landscape, and gradually, as you covered ground, the shapes that had been vague and distant from afar resolved into specific hills and trees and rivers, becoming more themselves the closer you got, until you were standing inside the landscape itself, and it surrounded you entirely. He asked her, on the 4th day, if she would ride out with him to look at the country west of town. He had a reason, he said. He wanted to look at something. She said yes, and they rode out together in the clear cold morning, Elijah on Copperhead and Emma on a horse she had been borrowing from Rodrigo Vargas during her stay in Marfa, a solid gray mare with excellent sense. The country west of Marfa in November was dormant and wide, the grasses a tawny gold, the mountains in the near distance rising blue-gray against a sky so blue it looked polished. The air was cold enough to see their breath and warm enough, in the direct sunlight, to feel like a gift. He led her to a section of land about 5 miles west of town, a broad, flat-bottomed valley between two ranges of low hills with a creek running through the middle of it, the water clear and cold over a gravel bed, cottonwood trees yellow-leafed along the banks. He had been speaking to a man in town about this land, he explained. The man owned it and was willing to sell at a price that Elijah had just enough money to meet, or close to it. It was good grazing land, with reliable water. Not huge, but enough for a modest operation. A man with skill and patience could build something on land like this over time. He stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the mountains and then turned to look at Emma, who was standing nearby with her arms folded against the morning cold, and the light was in her face, and she was looking at the land around them with the evaluating expression that he was coming to know as her default mode of engagement with the world. "You are thinking about buying this," she said. "I am thinking about what you think of it," he said. She looked at him then, the full, direct look of someone who was not going to let ambiguity slide by unchallenged. "Elijah, ask me what you are actually asking me." He took a breath. "I am asking whether you could see yourself in a place like this." "With you," she said. "With me," he said. "I know we have known each other for 4 days, in the conventional sense. I know that is not enough time for most decisions. But I also know what the past 3 years have been, and I know what these 4 days have been, and I think you know them too." She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was the kind of woman who would not let something this important be answered carelessly. She looked at the land around them, the creek, the golden grass, the mountains, and she looked at him. "My practical objection," she said slowly, "is that 4 days is not enough time to make a permanent decision." "Agreed," he said. "My other objection," she said, "is that I have been looking for you for 3 years and I am not inclined to manufacture difficulties where none actually exist." He smiled at that, the real smile, the one that reached his eyes. "Those two objections appear to be in conflict." "They are," she agreed. "I am working through it," a pause. "I think the answer is, not yet, not today, but I think the answer is also that I am not inclined to walk away from you now that I have found you." "That," he said, "is enough for me." They rode back to Marfa in the mid-morning light, not saying much. The silence between them, the comfortable kind, and something had shifted, was still shifting, in the measured and unhurried way of things that were going to be real and lasting. December came to Marfa in the form of cold nights and clear, brilliant days and occasional winds off the mountains that drove the temperature down sharply and sent dust spinning along the main street. Elijah took on work at one of the larger ranches north of town, breaking horses for the spring season, which provided both income and a legitimate reason to stay in the area. Emma continued her seamstress work and her partnership with dolers at the boarding house. They had supper together most evenings. They took Sunday rides when the weather permitted. They learned each other in the slow and detailed way that daily proximity makes possible, learning the smaller things. How Emma took her coffee, strong, no sugar. How Elijah handled unexpected frustration, very quietly, which was somehow more telling than noise would have been. How they argued when they disagreed, pointedly and with complete honesty, which was initially startling and eventually became one of the things each valued most about the other. And how they were, in the small, ordinary moments of ordinary days. He loved her by Christmas. He had probably loved her before that, but Christmas was when he recognized it as the specific thing it was. Sitting by Doller's fire on Christmas evening with Emma beside him and Rodrigo Vargas and his family around them. The children making noise and the food extraordinary and the room warm and good. And he looked at Emma's profile as she was laughing at something one of the children said. And the feeling that moved through him was so large and clear and uncomplicated that it could only be one thing. He did not say it immediately. He was not a man who said important things before he was ready to say them fully, and he was not yet entirely sure she was ready to hear it, though he thought she might be close. She told him first, as it turned out. It was a January evening, cold and dark outside. Dolers having gone to visit friends for the evening and the boarding house quiet around them. They were sitting in the parlor, Emma with some sewing in her lap and Elijah with a section of rope he was repairing, and the fire was burning well and there was nothing urgent happening, just the comfortable ordinariness of two people being together in a warm room, and Emma set down her sewing and said, without any particular preamble, "I love you, Elijah." He looked up from the rope. "I wanted to say it," she said, in a tone that was perfectly composed but had a quality of daring in it, the quality of someone who has made a decision to be brave, "because I have been thinking about it for some time and I find I have no interest in not saying it. You may feel differently, in which case—" "I love you too," he said. The composure she had been maintaining with considerable effort wavered briefly, just a flicker, and then she smiled, and the smile was so unguarded and warm and real that he set down the rope entirely. "Well," she said after a moment. "Good, good," he agreed. She picked up her sewing again, but she was still smiling, and so was he, and the fire cracked and burned, and the winter night continued outside, and inside everything was exactly right. He proposed to her in February of 1881, on a Sunday morning, at the edge of the creek on the valley property west of town that he had, by then, purchased. He had scraped together the final amount needed through 4 months of horsebreaking work, and a modest sale of the cattle he had accumulated small stakes in over the years, and the land was his now, registered in his name at the county office, a fact that still produced a quiet amazement in him every time he thought of it. The cottonwood trees along the creek were bare in February but catching the pale morning sun, and the creek was higher than it had been in November, running clear over its gravel bed. They had ridden out on a morning that was cold but still, no wind, the kind of winter morning that felt like the world holding its breath. He asked her standing at the water's edge, simply and directly, the way he had learned she preferred, without elaborate speeches or theatrical posturing, just the truth of what he wanted and the question of whether she would share it with him. She did not make him wait for the answer. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He had a ring, a small thing he had managed, a narrow band with a single small turquoise stone set in silver that he had commissioned from a Mexican silversmith in town whose work was extraordinary. Emma looked at it for a long moment when he produced it, and then looked up at him. "It is beautiful," she said, and the simplicity of how she said it was better than any elaborate gratitude would have been. He slid it onto her finger, and she looked at it there, and then she took his face in both her hands and kissed him, and the creek ran on beside them, and the cottonwood stood bare and bright, and the mountains were violet and distant, and the morning was perfect. They were married in April of 1881. The ceremony was small, as it necessarily was given that they had no family nearby, though Dolores Vargas stood up with Emma and Rodrigo Vargas stood up with Elijah, and the entirety of the local community appeared to have decided that their attendance was obligatory and welcome. Dolores made the wedding supper, which was astonishing in its scope and quality, and Rodrigo produced a bottle of brandy that was considerably better than anything available commercially in the region. And the evening was long and warm, and full of the particular happiness of people who have worked hard for something good, and are allowing themselves to fully inhabit the moment of having it. Emma wore a dress she had made herself, deep green, her best work, and Elijah wore the cleanest and most respectable outfit he had been able to assemble, and when he saw her coming toward him in the small church on Marfa's Main Street, he felt the same thing he had felt in the kitchen on the day he found her, that he was looking at something extraordinary, and that the extraordinary thing was looking back at him. The minister, a quietly competent man named Reverend Marsh, performed the ceremony with brevity and sincerity, and when he said the traditional words about whether Elijah would take Emma as his wife, Elijah said, "I will," with a certainty in his voice that produced a general exhalation from the assembled community, as if they had all been holding their breath. Emma said her own, "I will," with the same quality of settled certainty, the tone of someone who has thought this through completely, and is entirely at peace with the conclusion. And Reverend Marsh declared them married, and Dolores cried, and Rodrigo cheered, and Copperhead, tied outside the church, apparently registered the general celebration by pulling his hitching rail loose and wandering about 20 feet down the street before Elijah's ranch hand. A good-natured young man named Pete caught him and brought him back. They spent their first nights as a married couple in the boarding house, which was still their home, while they worked to make the valley property habitable. Elijah had been working on a house through the winter, with help from Rodrigo's sons and Pete, and by April it was close to finished. A small but solidly built structure of adobe and timber with a covered porch looking out toward the mountains and a proper kitchen, and 2 rooms and space to add more when the need arose. They moved in at the end of April, and the first evening they spent in their own house, cooking supper together in the kitchen, and sitting on the porch afterward in the cooling evening watching the light leave the mountains, was one of the best evenings Elijah could remember in his entire life. "This is ours," Emma said, looking out at the view. "This is ours," he agreed. The first year of their marriage was not without difficulty, because life on the frontier was not without difficulty, and they would have been foolish to expect otherwise. There was a dry summer that made the creek run low and required Elijah to haul water from a secondary source for the stock. There was a period in late summer when one of the horses took sick and required days of careful nursing before it recovered. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher about a section of fence line that Elijah handled with patience, and the neighboring rancher eventually acknowledged was legitimate. Emma established the house with the same practical precision she brought to everything, making it genuinely comfortable, finding ways to extend the function of each room, keeping a kitchen garden through the spring and summer that produced enough vegetables to supplement their supplies considerably. She continued to do seamstress work for the families in Marfa, riding in twice a week, and brought home both income and community connection, the web of relationships with the families in town that would prove, over the years, to be one of the most valuable things they had. In November of 1881, 6 months after their wedding, Emma confirmed what she had been quietly suspecting for several weeks. She was pregnant. She told Elijah on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly, while they were having breakfast, because she had decided that the matter-of-fact approach was the appropriate one, and had no intention of making the announcement into a theatrical event. He did not handle it matter-of-factly. He set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way a man handles something he is afraid of spilling, and he looked at her for a long moment with his entire face doing something complex and deeply happy, and then he got up from the table and came around to her side and held her very gently, with the particular care of someone who has just been informed that something they love contains something even more precious. "Are you well?" he asked, into her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said, into his shoulder. "I am, in fact, entirely well. I would appreciate if you did not treat me as though I have suddenly become fragile." "I will try," he said, and then quietly, "I am very happy." "I know," she said. "I am too." The winter of 1881 passed in the warmth of that knowledge, and Emma's pregnancy, while it produced its share of mourning difficulty in the early months, generally went well. She did not allow it to substantially alter her activities, refusing to retire from her seamstress work until February of 1882, when Dolores came out to the Valley House and essentially insisted on staying for the last 2 months. Dolores was, it emerged, something of an expert in childbirth. She had borne 5 children herself and had assisted in the delivery of various community members over the years, and she managed the arrival of Elijah and Emma's first child with a calm competence that was immensely reassuring. The baby arrived in late March of 1882, after a long and difficult labor that Emma endured with a determination that would have surprised no one who knew her. When it was over, when Dolores placed the wrapped bundle in Emma's arms, Emma looked at the face of her son and felt something so vast and complex that no language she had was adequate to it. "He has your eyes," she told Elijah, who was sitting beside her with his hand over hers and looking at the baby with an expression of pure, unguarded wonder. "He has your nose," Elijah said. "I can already see he is going to be stubborn." "That will be from you," Emma said, tiredly and happily. They named him Samuel James Conroy after Elijah's grandfather and Emma's father. Samuel proved to be an alert and vigorous child who slept adequately and ate enthusiastically, and had strong opinions from a remarkably early age. Dolores declared him a credit to the family before she returned to town. The letter from Austin arrived in the summer of 1882. It was a response to the letter Elijah and Emma had written the previous year on behalf of Rodrigo Vargas and his cousins. The Land Commissioner's office had looked into the matter, had requested the original land grant documentation, and had determined that the territorial agent Dobbs had indeed been operating outside his authority. The family's titles were confirmed. Agent Dobbs was removed from his position. Emma read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and when Elijah came in from the morning's work, she handed it to him without comment and watched his face as he read it. He looked up. "It worked." "It did," she said. He smiled, the full smile, and then they both laughed. And it was one of those moments in a marriage when two people who have done something together celebrate it together and feel the particular pleasure of shared work and shared result. They rode into Marfa that afternoon to deliver the news to Rodrigo, and the celebration that followed at Rodrigo's house was another of those warm, crowded, excellent evenings that would remain in memory, with the children running and the food abundant and Dolores producing what she claimed was a modest contribution, and which turned out to be an entire additional supper. The years that followed were good years, building years. Elijah built the cattle operation carefully, not rushing, acquiring stock as money permitted and land as opportunity presented. He had a gift for the work that went beyond the technical competence of someone who had spent years doing it. He had a sense for the land and the animals and the rhythms of the business that allowed him to make decisions that were almost always sound. By 1884, they had a small herd and a reasonable income and had added 2 more rooms to the house. Emma continued her seamstress work until 1883, when the volume of the ranch's demands on their time made it impractical to maintain the regular trips to town. She did not mourn the loss of the outside income significantly, because by then the ranch was generating enough to meet their needs, and she had found a different kind of work in the management of everything the ranch required that was not the cattle themselves. The accounts, the correspondence, the careful tracking of what was spent and what was earned, the negotiations with suppliers that she handled with a precision that saved them money annually. She was also, by the winter of 1883, expecting their second child. This one arrived in April of 1884, a daughter this time, a little less alarming in her arrival than Samuel had been and equally certain of her own importance from the outset. They named her Rose Clara Conroy, after Emma's sister and Emma's mother, and Clara, the real Clara, wrote from Tennessee with such warmth and happiness upon learning of her niece's naming that Emma spent the better part of an afternoon reading the letter multiple times. It occurred to Emma, and then to Elijah when she mentioned it, that they had not seen Clara in 7 years. Emma had not been back to Tennessee since before her parents died, and the distance and the cost of the journey had kept them apart for all the years since. But Clara was now 19 years old and was, she wrote, considering her options, and the letter contained a question embedded in its cheerful pages. Was there room in Texas for a woman who was willing to work and looking for a fresh start? Emma and Elijah discussed it seriously over a week of evenings and came to the same conclusion separately and simultaneously. Yes, there was room. There was specifically room in the form of the small room they had added to the back of the house with exactly this contingency in mind, though neither of them had admitted that at the time of the building. Emma wrote back to Clara and the invitation was extended, and by the summer of 1884, Clara Wainwright arrived in Marfa on the westbound stage, 20 years old, dark-haired like Emma, but with a lighter quality about her, a natural buoyancy that had survived everything their family's history had thrown at it. Elijah liked Clara immediately and without reservation, which told Emma something important, because he was not a man who liked people easily or quickly. Clara was smart and capable, and had a cheerful bluntness that complemented Emma's more precise directness in ways that made the house significantly livelier. She also took to Samuel with an enthusiasm that Samuel, now 2 years old and already developing his father's stubbornness in miniature form, reciprocated entirely, and she held Rose with the care of someone who understood what a miracle an infant was. Clara settled into life on the Conroy ranch with the ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, and over the year that followed, she became an indispensable part of the operation, taking over much of the household work that allowed Emma to focus more fully on the accounts and the ranch management, and becoming a recognized member of the Marfa community in her own right. She also, in the spring of 1885, met a young man named William Garrett, the son of a sheep ranching family from the next valley, at a community gathering that Dolers organized with her customary iron competence. William Garrett was 23 years old, steady and earnest and completely unprepared for Clara Wainwright, who regarded his initial shyness with the kind of patient amusement that suggested she had already decided he was worth the effort of drawing out. Emma watched this with deep satisfaction. She did not interfere. She did not need to. By the fall of 1885, William Garrett and Clara were keeping company in the approved fashion, riding out together on Sunday afternoons, and exchanging the kind of conversation at community gatherings that was obviously about a great deal more than whatever the surface subject happened to be. Elijah watched this with slightly more concern, because he felt a brotherly protectiveness about Clara that had developed over the years she had lived with them. But Emma assured him correctly that Clara was entirely capable of managing her own affairs. They were married the following spring, in the same small church where Emma and Elijah had been married 5 years earlier, and Dolers again made the wedding supper, though this time she allowed Emma and Clara's own contribution of a spectacular cake that Emma had been practicing in secret for 3 weeks. Elijah stood in the church next to William Garrett during the ceremony and felt, looking at Clara's face as she came in, and seeing the same expression of certain happiness that he knew had been on Emma's face on their own wedding day, a gratitude for the particular way the world had arranged itself so that all of this was possible. Emma sat in the front pew with Samuel beside her, and Rose in her lap, and watched her sister marry a good man, and felt something that was complete, something that had no lack in it. The years moved forward as years do, each one adding something new. Samuel grew into a boy who was, as predicted, enormously stubborn and also enormously capable, with a mind that retained facts with the tenacity of a trap and an instinctive understanding of animals that clearly came from Elijah's line. Rose grew into a small person of considerable force of character, which surprised no one and delighted nearly everyone. Elijah and Emma had a third child in 1887, another son, whom they named Henry William Conroy, and who arrived in the world with a calm that his older siblings had never possessed and maintained this quality as he grew, as if the universe had decided to balance its accounts with this one. By 1887, the Conroy Ranch was a genuine operation, not large by the standards of the great Texas cattle empires, but profitable and well managed and respected in the region. Elijah had built a reputation for honest dealing and sound stock, and buyers sought him out rather than the other way around. Emma's management of the financial side had proven, over the years, to be worth a great deal more than it would have cost to hire a professional bookkeeper, partly because of her competence and partly because of her investment in the outcomes, her deep and specific understanding of every number she recorded. They had also, over those years, maintained and deepened the connections to the Marfa community that Emma had begun building before their marriage. When a family lost a barn to fire in 1883, the Conroys were among the first to contribute to the rebuilding. When the school that Marfa was trying to establish needed a substantial roof repair in 1885, Elijah organized the labor and Emma organized the fundraising. When Rodrigo Vargas's wife fell seriously ill in 1886, Emma rode in 3 times a week to help manage the Vargas household until the woman recovered. They were a part of this place in the way that came from years of consistent and genuine engagement, and the community reflected this back to them in the specific warmth it showed them, the way it included their children in its life and brought its difficulties to their table and celebrated its occasions with them. Dolores Vargas had become, over the years, something so close to family that the distinction barely signified. She spent holidays at the ranch as often as at her own establishment, and she had a rocking chair on the Conroy porch that was understood by everyone to be hers when she was present. She and Emma had a friendship that was one of the best things Emma possessed, the kind of friendship between women that is built on complete honesty and mutual respect, and the particular pleasure of a truly interesting mind in regular proximity. On a September evening in 1887, Elijah and Emma sat on their porch in the cooling evening as they had sat on so many evenings, watching the light change on the mountains, the children inside with the sounds of their activity drifting out through the window. Henry was already asleep. Samuel and Rose were emphatically not, as evidenced by the periodically erupting argument about something whose subject Elijah could not determine from the porch. "Do you ever think about the photograph?" Emma asked. He looked at her. She was looking at the mountains, her profile turned to him, the particular quality of her attention that was not distance but something inward. "Yes," he said, "sometimes. I think about the morning I wrote those words on the back of it," she said. "I was sitting at the table in the Austin boarding house and I had no specific reason for the impulse. I just wrote it." "I am glad you did," he said. She turned to look at him. The evening light was on her face, and she was 32 now, and the years showed in her not as diminishment but as depth, as a quality of knowing and rootedness that was better than anything the photograph had suggested. He loved her at 32 in a way that was so much larger and more specific than anything he had felt at the beginning that the beginning, as extraordinary as it had been, felt like the outline of a thing rather than the thing itself. "I am glad I did too," she said, "though I think about what a strange and improbable business it all was." "It was," he agreed. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he said. Samuel produced a sound of considerable indignation from inside the house, and Rose's voice rose in pointed response, and they both turned toward the window with the automatic parental attention of people who had learned to distinguish between genuine distress and sibling competition. "Rose is winning," Emma said after a moment's listening. "Rose always wins," Elijah said. "She is very like you," Emma said. He looked at her with an expression of mild protest. "She is not stubborn." "She is enormously stubborn," Emma said. "She is also principled and determined and entirely direct, which is also very like you." He considered this. "Samuel is stubborn," he offered. "Samuel is stubborn and theatrical about it," Emma said, "which is entirely different. Rose is simply certain, which is worse." She paused. "Or better, depending on how you look at it." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand to receive his. And they sat like that in the September evening with the mountains going purple, and the first stars appearing, and the sounds of their children inside, and the ranch around them in the particular quiet that was not absence but presence, the presence of a life that had been built with intention and care over the years of their marriage. He had brought the photographs, both of them, from their separate protective cases, and had them framed together in a single frame that hung on the parlor wall, his image and hers, side by side. Not because they needed the reminder, but because the story they represented was one he wanted their children to know. It was a story about stubbornness and faith, and the willingness to cross a territory on the strength of an impulse that could not be fully explained but could not be ignored. Samuel had asked about the photographs once, had stood in front of the frame with the evaluating attention of a 7-year-old, and demanded an explanation. Elijah had sat down with him on the parlor rug and told him the story. He had told it simply and completely, the dead man's saddlebag and the tintype and the 4 words on the back, and then the 3 years of riding and asking questions, and the November afternoon in Marfa and the kitchen with the supper on the stove and Emma turning around, and all of it. Samuel had listened with complete attention, which was unusual for him. When the story was done, he was quiet for a moment. "She was looking for you too," he said. "She was," Elijah said. "At the same time." At the same time. Samuel thought about this with the gravity of a child processing a genuinely surprising fact. Then he said, "And you kept missing each other." "For a long time," Elijah said. "But you found her eventually," Samuel said. "I did," Elijah said. Samuel looked at the photographs in their frame and then back at his father with an expression that was thoughtful and serious. "I think you were both very stubborn," he said. "You are absolutely right," Elijah told him. Samuel nodded, apparently satisfied with this analysis, and went back to whatever he had been doing before the question arose. Elijah sat for a moment longer on the parlor rug and looked at the 2 photographs side by side and felt, as he always did, the quiet and uncomplicated wonder of the distance between that beginning and this present. Emma found him there a few minutes later and raised her eyebrows in a question. "Samuel asked about the photographs," he said. She came and sat beside him on the rug, looking up at the frame. "What did you tell him?" "Everything," he said. "The whole story." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been thinking that Rose is old enough now to hear it too." "Rose will have strong opinions about it," he said. "Rose has strong opinions about everything," Emma said. "That is not a reason to leave her out." She leaned against his shoulder in the comfortable, unthinking way of many years of marriage. "Besides, I want her to know that women can look too. That it does not only go one direction." He put his arm around her. "She already knows that. She has you for a mother." Emma made a small sound of acknowledgement that contained some warmth and some amusement, and some of that particular quality she had that was not quite modesty, but was its own kind of considered humility. In 1888, a letter arrived from Clara and William, by then established on William's family ranch in the next valley and expecting their first child. The letter was full of the particular joy of a pregnancy announcement written by Clara, which meant it was also full of detailed plans and observations, and a list of questions about Emma's experience that occupied 3 full pages. Emma sat down with a smile and wrote back immediately, providing every piece of information requested and adding considerable additional information that Clara had not specifically asked for but would certainly want. The following year brought more change. Elijah expanded the herd after a particularly good season, and Emma managed a renegotiation of their supply arrangements with the Marfa General Store that saved them a meaningful amount annually. Rodrigo Vargas's eldest son began working on the Conroy Ranch, adding able help that allowed Elijah to take on slightly less of the physical labor himself as he moved through his mid-30s, and this arrangement benefited both families in different ways. Henry, the youngest Conroy child, proved to be precisely what his early calmness had suggested. A thoughtful, observant child who absorbed everything quietly and produced, when he chose to speak, observations of considerable accuracy. He was 6 years old in 1893 and already following Elijah around the ranch with the focused attention of someone taking mental notes. "He is going to be a rancher," Elijah told Emma, watching Henry carefully examine the hoof of a horse with a seriousness that would not have been out of place on someone 3 times his age. "He is going to be whatever he decides to be," Emma said. "But yes, he loves it already." Samuel, by that same year, was 11 and had already demonstrated that his stubbornness, at least in the realm of books and learning, was a force of nature. He had read everything available to him in Marfa twice, and was beginning to petition, with considerable persistence, for additional materials. Emma had been writing to a bookseller in San Antonio, and packages arrived periodically with new volumes that Samuel fell upon with an urgency that struck everyone who observed it. Rose, at 9, was Samuel's best intellectual opponent and his most reliable antagonist, and the arguments they conducted were remarkable for their combination of logic and volume. Emma mediated these when necessary and otherwise allowed them to run, having determined that they sharpened both children considerably. The Conroy household was a full and particular place, with its own rhythms and sounds and specific atmosphere, shaped by Emma's precision and Elijah's steadiness, and the individual and powerful presences of 3 children who were each, in their different ways, entirely themselves. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Elijah and Emma had their own private time, the time that had been, through all the years of building and raising and managing and working, the consistent center of their life together. They talked about everything and nothing, about the day's events and the ranch's needs and the children's development and the larger matters of the world, the changing shape of the West as the frontier closed in around itself, the railroads coming, the great cattle empires shrinking or shifting, the question of what the next generation would inherit and what it would make of what it found. They argued sometimes, genuinely and specifically, over things that mattered to them both. They came to their different positions from the same foundation of honest engagement, and the arguments generally ended not with one person yielding, but with a position neither had held at the beginning, arrived at together through the productive friction of 2 strong minds in real disagreement. They were companions in the deepest sense of the word, and the romantic love that had begun with a photograph and 3 years of stubborn searching had not diminished over the years, but had grown into something more complex and more sustaining, something that included all the ordinary texture of a shared life and was not lessened but enriched by it. He told her this one evening in the autumn of 1889, when they had been married for 8 years and were sitting on the porch in the evening coolness, watching the last of the light. He said simply that he loved her more now than he had when they married, and that he wanted her to know it, and that he was aware this was perhaps a predictable thing for a husband of 8 years to say, but that it was also true. She looked at him for a moment with that evaluating gaze that still had the same quality as the first time he had seen it, still that combination of directness and depth. "I know," she said. "I love you more too." A pause. "It is one of the more satisfying surprises of my life." "What is?" "That it keeps growing," she said. "I knew I loved you when we married. I did not entirely know that love was something that expanded rather than contracted. I had seen marriages that contracted. I had wondered about it. And now I am not wondering," she said. "Now I know." He reached over and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, a small gesture that he had been making for 8 years and that still felt, each time, like the most natural thing in the world. She leaned into his hand briefly, and then straightened, and looked out at the mountains going dark in the falling evening, and was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was deeply content, the particular quality of stillness that was not absence but the fullest possible presence. By the middle of the 1890s, Marfa had grown considerably, as the railroad's extension through the region brought new activity and new settlers and new commerce. The town that had been barely a cluster of buildings when Elijah first rode in on a November afternoon in 1880 was now a recognizable community with a proper school and 2 churches, and a functioning telegraph office, and several businesses that would not have been out of place in a considerably larger settlement. The Conroy Ranch had grown proportionally, not in the dramatic way of the great cattle empires to the north, but in the steady and sustainable way of an operation managed by people who understood that consistent growth over time was more valuable than rapid expansion followed by collapse. They had good land, good water, a sound herd, and a reputation that attracted fair prices. Samuel was, by 1895, beginning to talk about the possibility of studying law, which surprised no one who had been listening to his arguments for the past decade. The nearest law school was a long way from Marfa, and the question of how this would be financed and managed was a real one. But Emma had been quietly setting money aside for several years in anticipation of this or something like it, and when Samuel made his intentions clear, she was able to tell him that the money existed. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been outmaneuvered by a superior strategist. "You knew," he said. "I had a strong suspicion," she said, "since approximately your 8th birthday." He went to study law in Austin in the fall of 1895, at 13 years old, which was young but not unprecedented for a young man of his preparation and demonstrated capability. He left with his father's handshake and his mother's letter of instruction to the boarding house where he would be staying, which the boarding house operator later told him was the most thorough and specific document he had ever received from a parent. Rose, at 11, was the undisputed authority of the household siblings in Samuel's absence, a role she accepted with the combination of responsibility and satisfaction that characterized her approach to most things. Henry, at 8, adjusted to the new hierarchy with his usual equanimity. Elijah watched his children grow up with a quality of attention that was the particular attention of a man who understood what it was to come from very little, to have had no family worth the word for most of his life, and who therefore did not take the existence of a family for granted for a single day. He was not a demonstratively emotional man, but his love for his children was visible in everything he did with and for them, in the patience he brought to their questions, and the seriousness with which he engaged their ideas, and the specific, individual understanding he had developed of each of their natures. He was, Emma had once told Dolores, the best father she could have imagined, which was a considerable statement given that she had a precise and demanding imagination. On the occasion of their 15th wedding anniversary, in the spring of 1896, Elijah and Emma had supper together alone, just the two of them, the children having been distributed to the Vargas household and Clara and William's ranch for the evening through a conspiracy organized by Dolores, who was now in her 60s, and still running the Marfa boarding house with the same iron authority she had always brought to it, though she had added a young woman to help with the work. It was a supper that Emma cooked herself, making the specific dishes that they had both loved best over the years, and Elijah had gone into Marfa earlier in the day and returned with a bottle of wine that was the best available, which was not exceptional but was perfectly adequate, and they sat at the kitchen table together and ate and talked in the way they always talked, about everything and nothing, moving between the practical and the philosophical and the personal with the ease of 15 years of practice. After supper they sat on the porch, as was their custom, in the warm spring evening with the mountains and the stars and the quiet of the ranch around them. 15 years, Emma said. 15 years from the wedding, Elijah said. 17 from the kitchen in Marfa, she smiled at the precision of it. 17 from the kitchen in Marfa, she agreed. When I turned around and there you were. When I walked in and there you were, he said. I knew who you were before I saw your face, she said. I have told you that. You have, he said. I have always found it remarkable. Not mystical, she said, which was a distinction she had always maintained. I heard Dolores say, Emma, you have a visitor, and there was something in the way she said it. 4 words, he said. She looked at him. What? 4 words, he said again. Dolores said 4 words, the same number of words as what you wrote on the back of the photograph. She was quiet for a moment working through this, and then she made a sound that was half laugh and half something more complex. I had never thought of that, she said. Neither had I, he said. It just occurred to me. The coincidence, or whatever it was, sat between them for a moment in the spring dark, and then Emma reached over and took his hand. Find me, she said quietly. I'm waiting. He looked at her in the darkness. This woman who had spent 3 years moving through a difficult and beautiful country looking for a stranger's face. This woman who had rebuilt a life after everything that had been taken from her and had done it with precision and grace. This woman who had become, over 17 years of knowing, the most fully known person he had ever encountered and who still surprised him, still showed him things he had not known were there. "I found you," he said. "I would do it again." "So would I," she said, "across every mile." The night was warm around them and the stars were extraordinary above the mountains, the sky of the Transpicos at its most absolute and clear. Somewhere in the house, the clock ticked on the mantel. Down in the valley, the cattle were settled and quiet. The creek ran in the dark, the same creek where he had stood with her on a November morning in 1880 and asked her, indirectly and then directly, whether she could see herself in this place with him. She had seen it. She had said yes. And everything that had followed, all the years and the work and the children and the difficulty and the joy and the ordinary and the extraordinary and the constant daily presence of each other in each other's lives, all of it had grown from that yes, from the 2 photographs and the 4 words and the 3 years of stubborn, faithful searching. In the summer of 1897, Samuel came home from Austin for a visit, nearly grown, 19 years old, carrying himself with a new confidence that was recognizably his own stubbornness and precision, but had been refined by 2 years of serious study into something more directed and formidable. He had passed his first examination with the highest marks in his group and was already beginning to think about where he would practice when he completed his training. Elijah shook his hand and felt the particular emotion of a father watching a child become a person in the fullest sense, someone who would go out into the world and make his own shape in it. Emma hugged him and then held him at arm's length and looked at him with her evaluating gaze and said, "You are well." "I am," Samuel said. "Better than well." "Good," she said. "Then sit down and tell me everything." Rose and Henry greeted their brother with enthusiasm of different qualities, Rose's being loud and specific and full of immediate demands for information, and Henry's being quieter and more considered, but no less genuine. The house was full in the specific way it was full when everyone it belonged to was in it, and Elijah stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and watched his family and felt the fullness of it all the way to his bones. That evening after supper, when the younger children were in bed and Samuel had gone to sit on the porch for some quiet, Elijah found Emma in the parlor, standing in front of the framed photographs, looking at them. He stood beside her. 2 tintypes in a single frame, slightly faded now with the years, his image and hers, the 2 people who had each carried the other across 3 years and hundreds of miles of territory. "We were so young," Emma said. "We were," he agreed. "I look so certain," she said, looking at her own image. "Standing there with my hand on that tree, I was not certain about most things in my life at that point." "You looked it," he said. "You look reluctant," she said, looking at his image. "I hated having my photograph taken," he said. "You still do," she said. "Yes," he admitted. She leaned against his side, and he put his arm around her, and they stood looking at the photographs together. These 2 young strangers who had reached toward each other across an impossible distance through the medium of a tintype and 4 words and the stubbornness of 2 people who were, when it came to the things that mattered most to them, simply not willing to give up. "I am glad it was you," Emma said, so quietly it was almost to herself. "There was no one else it could have been," Elijah said. She looked up at him, and the expression on her face was one that had no performance in it, no social construction, just the truth of a person looking at the person they loved most in the world, purely and completely and without reservation. He kissed her then, the way he had kissed her 1,000 times in 17 years of knowing her, and yet it was still specific, still particular, still the exact right thing to do in this moment, in this room, in this life that they had built together in the beautiful and difficult country of West Texas. When they drew apart, Emma turned once more to look at the photographs. "We should tell Henry the story soon," she said. "He is old enough." "Rose will want to tell it," Elijah said. "Rose will want to embellish it," Emma said. "She will," he agreed. "But the essential facts will survive." Emma smiled. "The essential facts always do," she said. They stood there a moment longer, and then Emma took his hand and they turned away from the photographs and went out to the porch, where Samuel was sitting in the warm night air looking at the stars with the contemplative expression of a young man who was thinking seriously about the future. They sat down with him, the three of them on the porch in the summer dark, and they talked for a long time about the ranch and the law and the town and the country, and where things were going and what came next. The mountains were dark shapes against the stars. The creek was quiet in its valley below. The house stood solid behind them, the house that Elijah had built with his own hands and the help of good people, the house that Emma had made into a home through the long and detailed work of years. Samuel would go back to Austin and complete his studies and eventually return to the region, setting up a practice in a growing town 2 days' ride to the east, where he would spend his career defending people who needed defending with the same stubbornness that had always been his essential quality. And he would marry a woman who was his equal in intelligence and his superior in patience. And they would have children who would carry forward something of all these people in the particular and unrepeatable way that families carry things forward. Rose would become, against the expectations of no one who knew her, a teacher, establishing herself in Marfa's school when the position opened in the fall of 1902, and teaching with a combination of precision and warmth that parents debated and students never forgot. She would, in time, marry as well, a man who was not intimidated by her confidence because he had enough of his own, and the match would be excellent in the particular way that excellent matches are. Henry would stay on the ranch. He would be there when his parents grew old, and when the ranch needed the steady, calm competence that had always been his essential quality, and he would expand it in his careful way and manage it with his father's instinct and his mother's precision. And it would last, the Conroy Ranch in the valley west of Marfa, through the years and the changes and the long passage from one century to the next. But all of that was still to come, still future, still unwritten on the summer night when Elijah and Emma and Samuel sat on the porch together and talked. What existed in the present was simply this: the three of them and the warm night and the stars and the mountains and the ranch around them, and behind them the house with its rooms where Henry and Rose were sleeping, and on the parlor wall the 2 photographs in their frame, slightly faded, slightly worn, the images of 2 young people who had somehow, across all the distances and all the uncertainty and all the improbable odds, managed to find each other. It had taken 3 years and hundreds of miles and a dead man's saddlebag, and 4 words written on impulse by a young woman in an Austin boarding house who had never expected those words to reach anyone. It had taken a cowboy who bought a saddlebag for the leather and found inside it a mystery that became a purpose that became the defining direction of his life. It had taken the willingness of 2 stubborn, practical, deeply feeling people to keep going when the easier thing would have been to stop, to trust that the effort would be justified, to believe that the thing they were moving toward was real even when they could not see it. And it had been worth every mile. Emma reached over, without looking away from the stars, and found Elijah's hand in the dark. He closed his fingers around hers, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said, because this was what they had found on the other side of all that searching, this specific and complete and unhurried happiness, this quiet evening on a porch in West Texas with their son beside them and their children sleeping inside and their whole built life around them in the summer dark. Find me. I'm waiting. He had found her. She had found him. They had found each other, which was the more accurate and more important truth, and everything that had come after, all the years and the work and the love that kept growing because that was the nature of the thing, had been the answer to those 4 words, the long and living and still continuing answer. The mountains were dark against the stars. The creek ran in its valley. The night went on around them, warm and full of crickets and the smell of dry grass and the particular sweetness of a West Texas summer evening, and Elijah Conroy sat on his porch with his wife's hand in his and felt, with absolute and uncomplicated certainty, that this was where he had always been going. He had simply needed to find the photograph to know it.